Hey everyone, I'm standing here at the corner of Kochi Stronghold and Dragoon Road, and appropriately there's a well running in the background. Sorry for the noise, but standing in front of this sign that says 35 miles per hour, earth fissures possible. So what's going on here? I want to tell you all about the groundwater crisis that's happening in Willcox and how I found this problem in my backyard. So get ready to get up to speed with the Willcox groundwater crisis.
Okay, so let's just get right into this issue in Wilcox, which is that large agricultural operations are pumping excessive amounts of groundwater out of the aquifer here. And this is a slide from the Arizona Department of Water Resources talking about the issues as a result of this, which are that people's wells are going dry. The land is literally subsiding, which means the entire area is just sinking. They say as much as 11 and a half feet, and the groundwater withdrawal is causing the land to fissure, which are giant cracks that originate hundreds of feet under the ground, and this happens when the groundwater is pumped out. So these are obviously very serious issues, and the governor of Arizona took historic action to address this issue in this past December 2024, which is that she established what's called an active management area, or AMA. So we're going to get into this and talk about where things are at now, but let's start with this AMA declaration. So this is from the Herald Review, which is a newspaper covering Cochise County. So they say it's official. The Willcox Basin is now an active management area, or AMA, and there was a prohibition on any new irrigation. Governor Katie Hobbs took the serious groundwater concerns of the small farmers and everyday folk to heart and required the Arizona Department of Water Resources, or ADWR, to review conditions in the 1,900 square mile basin that extends into Graham County. Agriculture is the biggest water user in the basin of the northern half of the Sulphur Springs Valley and uses about 155,000 acre feet a year. And 1 acre foot of water is about 300,000 gallons of water. It's the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. So the article continues, in some parts of the basin, the water level dropped over 400 feet, and nearly 50 miles of mapped earth fissures have developed. More than 1,200 wells have been drilled or deepened in the last 14 years, with no current checks or limits to groundwater pumping. Willcox officials, including the mayor and city manager, told Hobbs in meetings that large corporate farms use more water in a day than all of the residents of the town. They have set up water fill stations for residents whose wells have run dry. Land subsides and fissures are born when all the water is pumped out of a particular area in the aquifer. When the water is empty, the ground above collapses permanently. And to add a little bit of color to what a fissure looks like, this is another article from the Herald Review about a fissure that opened up last September 2024. And they have a photo, which it's a giant crack going across the road. So this poses an obvious safety hazard. They say it can create hazardous conditions for people, livestock, and infrastructure like water and gas lines. Damage to roads, driveways, and even homes can occur. And apparently these can happen after heavy monsoon rains. And they can also be a conduit to aquifers, which result in contamination of the groundwater. This is another picture of a fissure from the Arizona Geological Survey, and you can see that's probably 10 or 15 feet deep. And this is a map of some known earth fissures, and the line on the left, that's where I recorded the opening video, the intersection of Cochise Stronghold and Dragoon Road, and you can see there's a fissure going right across the intersection there, and I was able to find pictures of some fissures that have opened up on the road there. This is another picture from the Arizona Geological Survey showing the land subsidence in part of the Willcox Basin. And in this picture, you can see that the land has literally dropped almost 10 feet since 1969. And the Department of Water Resources says the rate of subsidence is accelerating, an increase from 1.2 inches per year in 1996 to 2.8 inches per year in 2023. So this is obviously a serious issue, and I live in the Willcox Basin. The Willcox Basin, I'll show you a map in a second, but It's a large area that is surrounded by mountains with no surface water. So the only water source available is groundwater, and all the rain that falls here just goes into the ground. And um, so, like I said, I do live here, and I bought land out here late last year, and I live pretty close to a pistachio orchard. So the biggest offenders are these nut orchards, which are pretty. There's a lot of them out here, and then there's a huge dairy called Riverview Dairy that has over 100,000 cows out here, and they're growing alfalfa for the cows, which alfalfa uses up a lot of water. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this has already affected me because I actually had a well share when I moved here. I had a quarter share of a well that was about 430 feet deep, and that already had to be deepened to 720 feet, and the total cost for that was $80,000. So I could have had a part of that if I paid $20,000, and I just opted out because I honestly wasn't even expecting to have a well when I moved out here. I'm intending to capture rainwater and see how far I can get on that. I do have neighbors who are successfully doing that for their personal needs, and so I got a 3,000 gallon water tank, and I'm getting water delivered. But that's just to illustrate the cost. And if you are located next to one of these wells, you're there's something called a cone of depression, which they basically suck out all the groundwater around them. And I don't know if I'm in the cone of depression or not, but um, so so yeah, this has affected me already, and more than other, that's a big problem. But also, the orchard has been a constant nuisance. There's a lot of loud noises, and they do have a well which I can hear running a lot of the time, which has just been driving me crazy because otherwise it's totally silent out here. And that's a big reason why I moved out here, was to enjoy nature and dark skies and just the silence of nature. And instead, I'm hearing this well running all the time. And not only is the noise annoying, but it's just the knowledge that they are actively pumping out the groundwater and destroying the environment here. And all wells are public information in Arizona, and so I looked up their well, and it's 1,200 feet deep, and they're pumping out 800 gallons of water. They can pump up. The capacity is 800 gallons of water per minute, which is huge. And for reference, a residential well is limited to 35 gallons of water per minute. So I did buy land here voluntarily, and I knew about that the water table is dropping, and I knew about some subsidence issues, and I did know about the earth fissuring. I don't think I understood the full gravity of the situation and how much attention this is getting in Phoenix and nationally. So would I buy land here again? I mean, I would say yes. So this has been the biggest downside so far, and maybe the positive is just it's forcing me to confront this issue. And this issue it's a symptom of a bigger problem, which is that our society is really optimized for corporations and making money instead of ensuring that we have a livable planet in the future. So maybe it's good that it's forcing me to confront this, because this basic problem is affecting all of us in a lot of different ways. So getting back to this active management area declaration, the Department of Water Resources lists their criteria for establishing one of these areas, which is that if they decide it's necessary to preserve the existing supply of groundwater, the area's only dependable water source for future needs, and land subsidence or fissuring is endangering property or potential groundwater storage capacity. And they determined that the Willcox Basin met these criteria. So what is an active management area? To explain that, I will show you the hierarchy of groundwater regulations in Arizona, and this is from the Department of Water Resources. So they say statewide, all wells have to be registered, and then the next level, the more restrictive level from that, is called an irrigation non-expansion area, where the expansion of irrigated acres is prohibited, and wells have to they have to measure how much groundwater they're pumping out and report that. And then beyond that is the active management area, which, in addition to those things, they also have what they call management goals, plans, and conservation programs. So in theory, over time, they can use the data that's gathered from measuring how much groundwater is being pumped out and make a goal, a reduction goal, to reduce that. In theory, I'll get into some of the issues with the AMAs and lack of actually achieving those goals. So that's basically what an AMA is, and this is a map of the active management areas in Arizona. And the first AMAs were established in 1980 when the Arizona Groundwater Management Act was passed, that act established these I think there were 4 initial AMAs, which included Phoenix and Tucson, which their goal for those areas was to achieve what they call safe yield, which is basically, this is from ASU, safe yield is a long-term balance between the annual amount of groundwater withdrawn and the annual amount of natural and artificial recharge. And since then, there are some new AMAs. Actually, I think Willcox and the Douglas AMA are the only 2 new ones since then. I'm going to get into how those were established. So talking about the AMAs and their effectiveness, this is an article from Arizona State University talking about 45 years of the Arizona Groundwater Management Act, which it's been 45 years since the first AMAs were established, and they had this goal to achieve the safe yield I was talking about by January 1st, 2025, which has obviously already passed. And ASU, they say, however, as of now, this ambition remains unmet. So they haven't met their goal. And that's why I guess just the reality is, really how effective is this AMA going to be? But let's talk about this attempt. So these issues, from what I could tell in Willcox, they really started becoming problematic about 10 years ago. From what I found, it was like 2014 and 2015 is when these large industrial agriculture operations started moving in, and that's when people's wells started going dry. So in 2022, there was a citizen-led initiative to establish an AMA in Willcox and Douglas. Douglas is just south of Willcox. So this is from the Herald Review, which says the 1980 Arizona Groundwater Management Act gives residents of a community the opportunity to set groundwater protections themselves on the ballot. This is the first citizen-initiated endeavor to form an AMA and was spearheaded by Arizona Water Defenders, a group of Valley voters who want something done to preserve water in the aquifers by limiting groundwater pumping. And I guess I didn't mention, but just by default, there's no restriction whatsoever on how much groundwater you can pump out in Arizona. So these citizens did get these AMA proposals on the ballot in 2022, which that was the first time that it had ever happened in Arizona. And the Douglas one passed, but the Willcox one did not pass. And I know some of my neighbors were involved in this effort to get this proposal on the ballot. So I want to ask people who were actually involved with this why this AMA didn't pass. My impression is that the AMA, everyone kind of recognized that it's not a perfect solution to the problem. But so stay tuned for, I'm kind of interested in that whole campaign and what happened. So I'm hoping to get a firsthand history of that at some point. So again, just talking about the AMAs and their effectiveness, this is from AZ Central, which says they're talking about these initial AMAs in Phoenix and Tucson trying to reach safe yield by 2025. They say there's no consequences in 2025 if we fail to reach the mark. The goal was simply to attempt to achieve a long-term balance by 2025. After that, good question. Here is the proposed management goal for the Willcox AMA, and this is from the Department of Water Resources. And the goal is to reduce groundwater overdraft by at least 50% by 2075, which I don't think that comes anywhere close to addressing the issue, especially over a 50-year period. And the Herald Review says that ADWR estimated there are 3.5 times more water going out than coming in, which led to declining water levels. And this Water Agenda newsletter, which I'll talk about more in a minute, they say the 50% reduction, if achieved, would mean the basin is only using twice as much water as it can sustainably afford to. Some say the goal is too lofty, while others say it's literally a half solution at best. So, I mean, that's what I would say. The other thing is these users have never had to measure how we don't know how much groundwater they are currently withdrawing because they've never had to measure that. I believe they had to install their measuring devices this past March. So what does a 50% reduction mean as a percentage? We don't know the absolute number of groundwater getting pumped out right now, as far as I know. And going back to this first article from the Herald Review about this executive order to establish the AMA, I'm going to introduce a character in this saga named Christian Sawyer. And they quoted Christian Sawyer in this article, and they say, Christian Sawyer, who now resides in the Douglas Basin, pointed out, some may be unhappy with the designation, but it is not irreversible. State legislators may be considering adjustments to the Willcox AMA in the next session. The AMA is not the end of the story, he added in the interview. It is just the beginning of negotiations. So who is Christian Sawyer? Christian happened to be one of the first people I met when I moved out here, and he has an interesting story. He agreed to come on my podcast at some point, the Inside the Dome interview series, because he has a really interesting story. He told me that he moved out here just intending to be an artist and like live in the desert, and somehow he got so involved with this water issue and other local issues like this that he started this Water Agenda newsletter that focuses on Arizona water issues. And he recently interviewed the Attorney General of Arizona on their YouTube channel for that. So it's pretty impressive how involved he's become in this over a relatively short period of time. I think he's been working on this for like 4 or 5 years. And this flyer about him is from the Southwest Alternative Building Conference, which I went to back in March. Shout out to Penny Parrish for putting that together. I found that really informative. And Christian gave a presentation basically encouraging people to engage with the political process, which started to change my thinking about that. I do have a history as an activist, and this is a picture of me on the steps of the Michigan State Capitol about 10 years ago. I moved out to Detroit about 10 years ago to get involved trying to protest different injustices that were happening. And the big issue in Detroit was, and I think still is, this water affordability issue where the city was shutting off people's water who could not afford their water bill. And you can't live without water, obviously. So this group called the People's Water Board was trying to get a water affordability plan passed to make sure that people's water bills never exceed a certain percentage of their income, which that's what's recommended by the United Nations. And the United Nations did come to Detroit when I was there because, I mean, we were arguing this is a human rights issue. You have to have access to water. And I spent about 2 or 3 years working on this. I was managing their website, and I also got involved with a lot of other issues happening in Detroit at the time. And after that time period, I just became really disillusioned with the political process because we had not made any measurable progress as far as I could tell on this issue. And it just seemed like the big money would always win in the end. They always had a way to get what they wanted. And what did it for me was I was working on this campaign to get a community benefits agreement ordinance passed. And the group I was working with, we did get our initiative on the ballot, but then this corporate-backed group just put a competing initiative on the ballot that was very similar, except not as effective. And the corporate version ended up passing, and our version didn't pass. And the situation was so confusing that for our version to pass, voters would have had to vote yes on ours and no on the corporate version. So they just have all these tricks to, in that case, I felt like they muddied the waters and just confused everybody. So ultimately, I basically disengaged from politics for a long time. And Christian's presentation started to change my mind because he told how it was a group of citizens who went in Cochise County and made sure that this builder opt-out provision was put in when the county adopted building codes in the early 2000s. And I would not have moved to Cochise County if that law wasn't here, which allows you to opt out of a building permit. So I am benefiting from people engaging in the political process. And I know it can be a very long and frustrating experience. And a lot of the times you don't get what you want. But he also gave some examples of how he was able to influence what's happening, because there's just not that many people out here and there's not many people engaging on these problems. So that started to change my mind. And then just being a property owner out here, obviously, like, I can't, this issue is literally in my backyard and it's not going to go anywhere. And so I can't really ignore it. And um I feel like it's good to at least be educated on this and understand why things are the way they are. And I feel like I might as well try to bring some attention to this if possible. And I also just feel like I should have a say in what, with me living here, I should have a say in what goes on around here. So, um, anyway, so that's Christian. And like I said, he, in this past January, so relatively recently, he started this Substack newsletter, which is an offshoot of a different Substack that just covers Arizona politics, called the Arizona Agenda. But so his newsletter is called the Water Agenda. And if you're interested in this at all, I really highly recommend checking it out. It's what I relied on to get up to speed on these issues. And he's a really good writer, and he just makes things really easy to understand for me, who's, like a regular person. And I would have a hard time parsing through all these different bills that are being proposed and understanding what's happening there. And so I think he's doing real journalism, and I signed up for a $5 a month subscription, and I encourage you to do the same if you find that useful. So let's talk about where things stand today with the help of Christian and his newsletter. He's not the only writer there. But getting back to his point that the AMA was only the start of negotiations, and so there's this other proposal that seems like it would be better than the AMA, and it's called a rural groundwater management area. So he writes, rural groundwater management areas, or RGMAs, would create RGMA councils with the authority to choose their preferred conservation goals and design unique groundwater management programs they feel are appropriate for their local area. After an RGMA is designated, its first 10-year management plan requires a 10% reduction in groundwater use by commercial water users, and subsequent management plans would adjust those reductions based on the progress made toward eliminating the overdraft. They also they allow these local councils to enact fees for commercial groundwater withdrawal, so they could basically charge these companies for pumping groundwater, and then they can put this money towards what he says conservation programs in the RGMA. An ideal outcome might see the largest RGMA water users paying fees, which help smaller farmers and municipal providers to conserve more water. So that's the proposed solution or improvement over the AMA, which I personally found a little bit underwhelming. I think a 10% reduction over 10 years is, again, we don't even know what that would mean in absolute terms, as far as I can tell, if we don't know how much is currently being pumped out. And I just think that there's going to be a lot more harm done in those 10 years. So it would give the local area more control over what happens, versus right now it's just the Department of Water Resources decides everything. So I'm looking forward to asking Christian more about this and the pros and cons when he comes on the podcast. The big hurdle is that it has to get past this representative, Gail Griffin, who has been shutting down any meaningful groundwater regulation or reform for years in Arizona. She's the chair, Christian writes, of various natural resource committees in the House and Senate, and she is able to just single-handedly prevent a bill from getting a hearing if she doesn't like it. So the governor, in announcing this Rural Groundwater Management Act, and this happened earlier this year in January or February, she addressed Gail Griffin because this has to get past Gail Griffin for it to even have a chance of passing. So this is obviously a huge problem, and Gail Griffin has been getting a lot of attention. The Associated Press just wrote an article about her, and Christian also wrote an article about her. So again, this is the big hurdle that's preventing any progress on this issue. So in his article, Gail Griffin versus Arizona, Christian writes, her frustrated colleagues on both sides of the aisle call her the Queen Bee of Water. Other honorifics include the Gatekeeper and Grim Reaper of water legislation. Her throne is the chair of various natural resources committees in the House and Senate over the years, where she's frustrated bipartisan efforts to update Arizona's antique groundwater laws. Her name is Gail Griffin, and she's an 80-year-old real estate veteran who's been representing Southeast Arizona in the legislature since 1997. And he says she's been able to stalemate groundwater policy progress with endless negotiations, aimless ad hoc committees, and a stern refusal to hold hearings for policy reform bills. But the problems of water can't be pinned solely on Griffin. If water policy continues to go sideways over the next 2 years, cast an eye at House Speaker Steve Montenegro for not reining Griffin in, and cast the other eye at lobbying groups from real estate, corporate agriculture, and energy who prop her up. And that's the bigger problem here, because she's going to be term limited out in 2026, but what's to stop somebody else from taking that committee position who's just going to do the same thing? And this is a big structural problem because it's just extremely easy for corporate interests to block any kind of regulation from passing. So I really don't know what the answer is with that. And like I said, this is from the Associated Press, which is a pretty big national news organization. Wrote an entire article about Gail Griffin titled "Longtime Lawmaker Shapes the Debate as Arizona Grapples with Dwindling Water Supplies." And they say, throughout 2 decades marked by drought, climate change, and growing demand for water, Arizona's leaders have fiercely debated an increasingly urgent problem: how to manage dwindling water supplies in an arid state. At the crossroads sits Representative Gail Griffin, a savvy and quietly assertive lawmaker who has for years used her status as the leader of key water and land use committees in the Republican-controlled legislature to protect property owners' rights deciding which bills live and die. So that's kind of where things stand. It's really unfortunate because that Rural Groundwater Management Act has bipartisan support, and Christian talks about how certain lawmakers have proven that she is blocking bills that would otherwise be passing with Republican and Democratic support. Because, for example, the mayor of Willcox was at the governor's announcement ceremony for that Groundwater Act, and I read that Willcox's municipal wells have been going dry. So Republican mayors of these towns are in support of reform. And so, again, this just shows right now, at least, how the corporations have a stranglehold on what's happening around here. And it's led to these absurd situations. I already told you about this large dairy operation in the Willcox Basin, but there's kind of an even worse situation in southwest Arizona, which is this Saudi Arabian company called Fondamonte. So this is from CBS News, and they say, Fondamonte, which is owned by one of the largest dairy companies in Saudi Arabia, bought vast tracts of desert in western Arizona on top of a massive groundwater aquifer, in part because there are no regulations on how much water can be pumped out of the ground. And the reason why this Saudi Arabian company came to Arizona is that Saudi Arabia has enough regulations to prevent growing water-intensive crops like alfalfa over there. So it just shows how lax or non-existent the regulations here in Arizona are, and it's just an absurd situation if you want to look more into that. So that's pretty much where things stand right now. The the Rural Groundwater Management Act has not even gotten a hearing yet, and there was this competing Republican proposal, which the Water Agenda has an article about it called Liquidate the Locals. Again, they passed something that's very similar to the Groundwater Management Act, but it's just more corporate friendly. The local council has reserved seats for agriculture representatives, and the representatives on the local councils don't actually have to live in the Willcox Basin or whatever local area they're managing. So that's the kind of stuff that Gail Griffin is advancing, along with other absurd policies like building a pipeline from the Mississippi River to Arizona. And Christian gets into all that stuff. So it's not even a serious effort at confronting this obviously serious problem. And what is the future of Willcox if the status quo continues? Well, again, I found out about this by reading the Water Agenda, but there's this region in India called Rajasthan, and its climate is very similar to Cochise County. It's very dry with a rainy monsoon season. And they also were pumping out groundwater to farm, and they pumped out enough groundwater that everyone's well went dry. And a lot of farmers are having to move to cities to work in factories. And that's what I've heard the plan is for these, like I said, this orchard and their 1,200-foot well is these corporations just are going to pump out all the groundwater until it reaches 1,200 feet, at which point it's not economically feasible for them to continue pumping. And then they, I assume, will just pack up shop and leave. So it's pretty bleak future if the status quo continues. But reading about Rajasthan, I did learn about these this article calls them ancient water harvesting structures called kadins. And again, in a very dry area of Rajasthan, which is even, they get 4 to 8 inches of rain in this one area where this article talked about, which that's pretty much how much rain Phoenix gets. I get this area where I live gets more rain than that, but they basically make these big basins where all the rainwater drains, and then they've been able to farm crops there. And again, this technique has been used for thousands of years. So it is possible to live in these arid climates, but you have to work with the natural landscape, and you can do these things using simple earthworks and managing rainwater falling. On that note, I found these videos about a couple of villages in Rajasthan which built very extensive earthworks to manage the rainwater there. And that area, they get about 12 to 15 inches of rain, which is almost exactly the same as the Willcox Basin. And over a period of 50 years and hundreds of people involved, they built these earthworks, and today they have perennial bodies of water. They just have water sitting in these basins all year round. And they say they can survive 3 years of drought. They also have been able to dig shallow wells where the water, they say, is maximum 50 feet from the surface. And in the rainy season, the water is almost at ground level. So I found these videos really interesting. It just shows what's possible working with nature, and again, just using these simple earthworks. They built a canal so that when one basin overflows, it'll flow. It was like several miles long to the next village. So it was just really interesting how the local people there are connected with how they're managing the groundwater. And they talk about how prosperous the area has become, and they're able to have livestock, and they have excess milk that they're getting that they can sell, and they planted so many trees that they say it doesn't even get as hot anymore. So it's really incredible, and I don't see any reason why this type of thing can't happen in Cochise County. It's just we have to make this decision if we are going to, as a society, prioritize making a profit or ensuring that this is a place where we can continue to live. And I know most people are on the side of having a healthy planet. It's just these other interests are able to, I guess, prevent this from happening right now. So why should you care about this if you don't live in the American Southwest, which is a very dry climate? Well, I only found out about this last year, but the Mississippi River is drying up, and in 2022 and I think 2023, the water levels got so low that ships were having a hard time navigating the river, and people were able to just like walk to islands that normally you would have to take a boat to reach, and there was like Civil War relics being exposed. So I just think that, and this is also based on other books I've read, which I might do a book review of Brad Lancaster's book about rainwater, and then there's another book called Sowing Seeds in the Desert by Masanobu Fukuoka, and they both just talk about how, you know, a landscape can become a desert if you don't manage the rainwater the right way. And so this issue really affects everybody, no matter where they live. And showing the effect of groundwater pumping on rivers, or the effect of these earthworks. There is this video by Andrew Millison, who teaches permaculture, and they talk about this river in India that was made to flow again after being dry for like 50 or 60 years, just by making some simple dams to make sure that the rainwater would soak into the ground. So that's something else you can check out. Also in Cochise County, the San Pedro River, which is one of the last free-flowing rivers, which means there's no dams on it, its water levels are declining, and the Center for Biological Diversity and the Army Corps of Engineers both found that Decades of groundwater pumping at Fort Huachuca, which is located nearby, has depleted the aquifer to the point that it's affecting the river's water levels. So this groundwater issue, like I said, I think this is of critical importance for our society, and I think on a mass level and a national level, we should be building these earthworks if we want to have a planet that we can continue to live on in the future. And so that's why I'm making this video, because this is an issue that's in my backyard and it's affecting me personally, but it's touching on a lot of issues that are affecting a lot of us. So I'll end with this quote by Bill Mollison, who's the founder of permaculture. And he says, "Though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple." And I think that if we do just use these simple water harvesting techniques that have been used for thousands of years by human beings, that we can solve a lot of these problems, and our over-reliance on groundwater is really degrading the planet. And Willcox is one of the most egregious examples of that. So that's what I have to say about the groundwater crisis. I guess what I feel like I potentially can bring to the equation is people power. And if there's parts of this process going into the future where just people weighing in on this could sway things one way or another, I do feel like I have at least a small platform here with my YouTube channel and podcast. Thank you to everyone who's been watching and subscribing, as well as there's going to be a lot of people coming out here to help me with this project. And I think a lot of people are going to fall in love with the area, and it's stunningly beautiful. And I just think a lot of people are going to want to protect and preserve this place. And hopefully we can get some more attention to what's happening here. So for more videos about this, you can check out, I found one by a channel called More Perfect Union on YouTube, and then another one by NBC News. So they talked a lot more about the dairy farm out here, and they also just have some great shots of the area, and you can get a better visual for the Sulphur Springs Valley. And this other one is by the Lincoln Land Policy Center, and they talk about the problem, and then they facilitated a workshop a couple of years ago with all the water users out here to try to come up with some kind of compromise solution to start to do something about this, which I found that pretty interesting. So I hope you found that interesting. Let me know what you think, and look in the description of this video or podcast episode. I'm going to put a webpage together with links from all the articles that I was reading from and all the videos that I included in here. And that's it for now, and I will talk to you later.